Hey everybody, I'm going to bring up a picture of Davy Crockett here. So when I last left you, or when I last saw you on Monday, what had happened is that Santa Anna's army had marched up from central Mexico. It took them a while to get there. Santa Anna, after the capture of the Anahuac Fort in the summer of 1835, the early summer of 1835, decided he needed to come into Texas and crush the rebellion in Texas. Remember, Mexico City, whether it was run by the Mexicans or by the Spanish, was always very, very sensitive about Texas because Texas traditionally had been a border province. And as I said before, Santa Anna, in coming up into Mexican Texas, he's doing something that he'd done before. But when he'd done it before in the 18 teens, like 1813 or so, he'd been an officer in the Spanish army when Arredondo had come up. And so there was a context for his actions and his thinking. So it took him a while to gather his forces, this army of about probably over 5,000 men. They march up from central Mexico, cross the Rio Grande at Laredo and Eagle Pass in early 1836, and head towards San Antonio. And as you know, Houston had hoped that San Antonio would have been abandoned, but the folks on the spot, Travis, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and Juan Seguin, Crockett and Juan Seguin really weren't decision makers. Crockett was more of a mediator. But especially Jim Bowie and William Barry Travis had decided that San Antonio could be defended. So they did what Houston did not want them to do. They stayed in San Antonio. They were surprised by the approach of Santa Anna's army, the vanguard of Santa Anna's army. Again, it's important to realize that Santa Anna can't get his army to San Antonio all at once. So it's kind of strung along the road between, say, northeastern Mexico and San Antonio. The road system was pretty terrible. It's a large army. So it's going to take a while for his troops to all get to San Antonio. But Travis and his men, one of his men spots the lead columns of Santa Anna's army, and then Travis orders the Texas defenders, about 186 men or so, to retreat into the Alamo. Many of them have to scramble because some of them had pawned their weapons because of the Washington birthday celebration that they had just celebrated. So there's a kind of a mad scramble, but ultimately Travis is able to get his men into the Alamo before Santa Anna army arrives in force. The problem with this militarily is that the Alamo was too big a space for 186 men to defend. If Travis had had 2,000 men, maybe even less, the Alamo might have been defended forever. But as it was, Travis only had 186 men. So one of the ways to think about the Alamo story, and it's a little bit different than it's often portrayed, is Travis traps his soldiers in the Alamo. Because what happens is that Santa Anna very easily is able to lay a siege around the Alamo as his army continues to come up from the southwest in the weeks after the vanguard of the army reaches San Antonio in late February 1836. So Travis militarily, I think you can make a good argument. He makes a major mistake. He traps his men in the Alamo. It would have made a lot more sense in a lot of ways if he had just fled San Antonio, but who knows? Sometimes like events, it just seems like there's more powerful forces at play, and I don't want to go all religious on you. And there's different kinds of religion, but sometimes it just seems like things are meant to be. Sometimes it's very clear the choices that humans make, but sometimes it just seems like there's greater forces at play. But anyway, Travis traps his men in the Alamo. And then it gets very interesting. When I was a kid, you always heard a story that Travis drew a line in the sand with his sword and said that anybody that wanted to leave the Alamo, didn't want to fight, was welcome to. now there's quite a bit of dispute whether or not that happened or not. It's a very disputed story. Another disputed story, which you should understand the context of it now, for those of y'all that have been paying attention, the story that the flag that flew over the Alamo, the mission complex. By the way, the mission complex of the Alamo in 1836 was much larger than what you see today. I think a lot of people that come to the Alamo are a little bit disappointed initially because it's kind of small. It's surrounded by downtown. You hear so much about it, and then you see it. It doesn't seem that big. Well, the original mission complex, the one that Travis and his men tried to defend, Davy Crockett, Jabouille, and Seguin, the area, the walled area, was much larger than you see today. So that's one of the things you need to keep in mind as you're thinking about this battle. So the line in the sand, very contested, very unclear if that happened. The other thing that I was taught, that the 1824 flag flew over the Alamo, that what the defenders of the Alamo were really protesting was not necessarily advocating for Texas independence. They were more protesting Santa Anna's dictatorship. And so by flying the 1824 flag, what they're doing is they're talking about a constitution that a lot of Texans had supported. Although, there were, as I've talked about at great length, there were aspects of it, especially Texas being a sub-department in this larger state of Coahuila, Tejas. On the whole, most Anglo-Texans were Federalist because they felt like slavery would be better protected in a Mexican nation where most of the power, especially the decision-making over questions like slavery, came at the local level or at the state level rather than the national level. So, again, it's kind of unclear whether that's true or not. It shows the complexity of the story of the Alamo. Another thing that shows the complexity of the story of the Alamo is that Tejanos, the role of Tejanos in the Alamo, as I talked about towards the end of class on, let's see how much time, okay, as I talked about towards the end of class, Tejanos had a kind of an odd position in the Alamo, and really they're some of the victims of the ultimate victory of the Texas Revolution. But for Tejanos, it was a little bit unclear. Okay, they don't really want to break with Mexico. They didn't like Mexico City, but I do think they considered themselves Mexican. They're revolting against Santa Anna, but they're kind of teaming up with a group of Anglos that are, such as Travis, for instance, that are absolutely convinced that Texas has to leave Mexico and become ultimately an independent nation. And then maybe down the line, as we know happened, Texas would become a state in the United States. So the role of Tejanos is a little bit, it's ambiguous. Most Tejanos actually went underground as Santa Anna marched towards the Alamo. They had memories of what had happened when Arredondo had come up in 1813. And one of the things I want to get across to you in this course is the memory of the experience of the earlier Texas Revolution within the context of the Mexican Revolution against Spain. It casts a very long shadow over the events of 1836 that's often forgotten in the public memory of the Alamo to this very day. So most Tejanos just got the hell out of Dodge. They went to their ranchos. They didn't know which way to turn. They hated Santa Anna, but Santa Anna has a 5,000 or so person army. They don't want to get killed. Many of them like the Anglo-Americans, but they're not quite ready to break from Mexico. So it's an ambiguous role for many of the Tejanos, except for folks that fought with Seguin. And one of the reasons these folks fought with Seguin, and one of the reasons that Seguin joined with Stephen F. Austin, is he had very close personal relations with Stephen F. Austin. He was offended by Santa Anna becoming a dictator. He wanted to break Texas from the dictatorship of Santa Anna. And so The role of Tejanos is a little bit ambiguous, and I think it's pretty much largely forgotten, although it's being recovered in more recent days or in more recent years. I think ultimately something like 8 Tejanos died in the Alamo. Six escaped, including one Seguin, not because they were cowards. They were asked to leave by Travis to go to Goliad and to convince the garrison at Goliad to come and add support to the Alamo. It never worked out. Seguin did make it down to Goliad, but the folks at Goliad were a mess. They didn't know what they were doing, and they never made it to San Antonio, obviously. So this is another kind of complicating factor, the story of Tejanos within the Alamo context, that in public history and the public memory of the Alamo is often forgotten.